Bergson and the holographic theory of mind. Continuing, this is part 3R, that is, it's being re-recorded to make it more fluid, quicker, and less clunky than it was when I first started this stuff. So this is on time, and we'll be looking at the classic metaphysic of space and time, underlying all our science, psychology, etc., versus the temporal metaphysic of Bergson, which is what we really need. Why and how we see the past. We're always looking at the past. The key concept of scales of time ignored, the relation of subject and object, and Bergson's unique panpsychism, not yet understood by the whole of panpsychic literature. So let's go. So a quick review from video number 1. The universe is holographic. This was Bergson's principle, anticipating the holographic discovery in 1947 by over 50 years. He noted, looking at the quote down there at the bottom, that there is no photograph of the external world in the brain, but rather the photograph is already developed in the very heart of things and at all points of space. So this holographic field is a vast interference pattern. It's non-imageable. It looks nothing like the external world that we know. And I noted this is not the holographic principle in current physics, a la Lenny Susskind. You can see number 39 for a critique on this. And the brain is or forms a modulated reconstructive wave passing through this holographic field. By modulated reconstructive wave, looking at the little red box in the top corner there, we're passing a wave set, a reconstructive wave set, call it frequency 3, a coherent frequency, through that plate. And it's specifying to the eye of the observer the original object wave paired with that reference wave frequency, another reconstructive wave. In this case, the cup. If I modulate it to frequency 1, I will now see the wave front, a source of the cube and ball, as an object wave paired originally with the reconstructive wave or reference wave of frequency 1. If I modulate to frequency 2, I will see the original source, in this case, a wine glass. Modulate back to frequency 1. Again, we see the original source, the cup. So the brain, in this case, is serving as the reconstructive wave passing through the holographic plate, that is the universal field. It's acting as a very concrete modulated reconstructive wave, and it's specific to a source in the holographic field. In this case, now an image by this process, an image of this field, the coffee cup on our kitchen table. Again, remembering that on that holographic plate, the interference pattern looks very little like either the cup, the wine glass, the pyramid ball. So the brain is a modulated reconstructive wave specific to a source. Now by that process, an image, the coffee cup on our kitchen table. There is no image of the coffee cup in the brain. Again, the brain / wave is simply specific to a source in the holographic field. That is, that cup is right where it says it is, according to common sense, external and within the field. But there is no viewer, no homunculus. That is, we have to remove the viewer in the holographic process. There's no little man inside the brain looking at the external image. So we're going to discuss now then how Bergson removes the viewer. That is the problem of the relation of subject and object. And related to this, highly correlated, is the fact that we are seeing a past transformation of this holographic field. The fly is perceived as normally perceived as a blurred wing beats of long ago come and gone that we're looking at. So how is this past specification possible? This is all linked to the problem of subject and object. So now to Bergson's model of time and his temporal metaphysic. So first we have to understand the classic metaphysic. This is essential. Underlying current physics is the classic metaphysic of space and time. Relativity, it should be understood as simply the logical epitome of this metaphysic. The metaphysic is a general conceptual structure on space, time, and motion. It's an epistemological framework, so to speak. It is a projection frame, shall we say, for our theories of the real, both in physics and psychology. It's an abstract space that is imposed, an arbitrary and static conceptual backdrop placed against the events of the transforming world. It is ubiquitous, ingrained, and extremely useful. It underlies mathematics, or a mathematical treatment of the transforming universe of matter. It is the support of calculus itself. It lies beneath AI in our concept of the brain as a form of computer. Its usefulness is so enthralling it is taken as an ontological reality, that is, as the actual structure and dynamics of the ever-transforming field of matter. For Bergson, this conceptual structure is obscuring our deeper penetration into the physical world. It is precisely the job of theory, Bergson argued, to break through this imposed framework. To quote, "A theory of matter is an attempt to find the reality hidden beneath customary images which are entirely relative to our needs." Important statement. We'll see why. Again, emphasizing the dependence of our conceptual structures, that's that sentence, on bodily action, he would note, to quote, "But the materiality of the atom dissolves more and more under the eyes of the physicist. We have no reason, for instance, for representing the atom to ourselves as solid rather than as liquid or gaseous, nor for picturing the reciprocal action of atoms by shocks rather than any other way. Why do we think of a solid atom, and why of shocks? Because solids, being the bodies in which we clearly have the most hold, are those which interest us most in our relations with the external world." So as noted, the metaphysic, the classical metaphysic, is an abstract space, in Bergson's terms, a principle of infinite divisibility. Infinite divisibility. It is a space that indeed arises in our cognitive development from our basic bodily needs. Perception initially identifies objects on which our body can act. A bottle, a rattle, a block, a nook. So the world is partitioned into objects and their motions. Objects, in turn, are rarefied to the continuum of spatial points or positions. So just a visualization of this continuum of points, positions. It's actually a 3D continuum. We're seeing 2D there. So every object in the continuum is infinitely divisible, and the continuum of points is infinitely divisible. It is, as it were, as Bergson noted, a mental diagram or mesh placed beneath extensities, those little squares we can expand or contract at will to ultimately mathematical points. By extensity, he means this, the actual concrete material world. Extensity, as opposed to the treatment of the continuum in terms of points and positions. So when an object moves from point A to point B over this continuum, as we move our cup, it is conceived to trace a trajectory or a line, that is a space. The line consists of a set of points in this continuum. Each point momentarily passed over by the object is conceived to correspond to an instant of time. So each point becomes an instant. Thus time in this framework is treated as just another dimension, the fourth of this abstract space. But when motion is treated merely as a set of points, as the line, a space is infinitely divisible, then to explain the motion between each pair of static and mobile points, we must insert a new line with its points. For example, our little fly there flying from point A to point B. We insert a line between points, but that line between the first 2 points there is, again, an infinitely dense set of points. And between each pair of points and that, second line, we can introduce another line with, again, an infinitely dense set of points. In other words, this is an infinite regress. We must do this process over and over again, ad infinitum. It's an infinite regress. Treating motion in this way as sets of points. Always between each static point seems to be the motion. So this treatment, Bergson argued, is the root cause of Zeno's paradoxes. Remember the Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles continually halves the distance to the tortoise as he runs along this infinitely divisible line or space. So it's an infinite operation, halving. He never catches the tortoise. Again, the arrow, the flying arrow for Zeno never moves. For at any instant, it is at rest at a static point in this space. So there's some popular misconceptions there of Zeno and his paradoxes we want to kind of clear away right away. One is Bertrand Russell solved all these. He did not. He accepted the arrow paradox as valid, thinking Weierstrass and his treatment of infinitesimals had rationalized it. To quote there, Weierstrass, by strictly banishing infinitesimals, has at last shown that we live in an unchanging world, and that the arrow at every moment of its flight is truly at rest. So you see, he's solving it by accepting it. He did not touch the fourth paradox, that is, in Zeno's terms, a duration is the double of itself, though it has the same root problem that we'll see, that is motion being treated as a space, as the other three. And he reversed himself from 1903 there to 1911. Again, another misconception is there are calculus/math solutions, which kind of where Russell was. There are not. And we'll look at one of the major versions of this. Save for Bergson's analysis, we're about to look at the problem remains. For Bergson, motion, thus the transformation of the universal field, namely time, must be treated as indivisible. Achilles moves in indivisible steps. He most certainly catches the tortoise. Motion, Bergson argued, should be conceived as a melody, where each note, that is instant, interpenetrates or permeates the next, each reflecting the entire series, forming an organic whole. From this perspective, the motion of time itself carries an elementary form of memory, as we'll see. In the classic metaphysic, where the time consists of a series of discrete instants, each instant falls into the past as the next, that is the present instant, arrives. So each instant is continuously falling into the past, where the past is our symbol of non-existence. Matter only exists at the present instant. Everything else behind it, that present instant, is non-existence. The brain, of course, is matter. It only exists for the duration of an instant. It is assigned the task of somehow instantly storing each present instant to preserve it. No, the time transformation of the holographic field is indivisible. There are no instants that fall instantly into the past, into non-existent, as the next, that is the present instant, arrives. This indivisible motion is the glue of the, quote, instants, unquote. The brain, as a reconstructive wave, is able to optimally specify a past motion of the indivisibly transforming holographic field, as stirring spoons, buzzing flies, falling, twisting leaves, the plastically deforming knot cubes we talked about in number 2, all transforming in an indivisible flow. The brain is not relying on mythical, logically impossible, short-term storage areas of static memory, yet to be found, to store these flows. This relates to another short-term memory solution, quote unquote, for registering motion, namely the continuity of neural processes. Let's quote Taylor from 2002. The features of an object, bound by various mechanisms to activity and working memory, thereby provide the content of consciousness of the associated object. In these, as neural activity loops, neural activity relaxes to a temporarily stable state, therefore providing the extended temporal duration of activity necessary for consciousness. So this continuity, the extended temporal duration of activity, is said to support perceiving the rotating cube, or above there, the flapping wings of the heron. This, that is a violation of the logic of the classic metaphysic, which dictates why storage must be in the brain in the first place, to preserve the just past instant. Again, we have an infinitely divisible line. Again, the time extent of an instant is ultimately a mathematical point. So each instant has the logical time extent of a mathematical point. So the brain is equally embedded in the sequence of instants of the classic metaphysic. So this is the logical time extent or continuity or temporal duration of activity, quoting Taylor, of the brain and its neural processes. So you can't see the rotating cube or the flapping wings and stay within the classic metaphysic. It's logically inconsistent. Again, because the logical time extent or continuity is a mathematical point. So such a point is neither start nor end, mathematical point. There is nothing to divide. It is static. It has no extent in time. But again, this is the logical time extent of neural processes within the classic metaphysic. This is why, for any event, the classic model of time demands, quote-unquote, storage of each instant in some short-term memory store as static snapshots or states to be integrated as a whole time-extended motion. So taking the dynamic transformation of the chewing the carrot there, it's got to be stored as a series of states, maybe schematic states. But now these are static. These are static snapshots. They have to be integrated as a whole time-extended motion, for example, by an internal scanner with all the logical problems, because now you have to explain how the scanner works. So appealing to the continuity of neural processes is just a logically inconsistent attempt within the classic metaphysic to escape this. In physics, the notion of the indivisibility of motion is knocking at physics' door. De Broglie noted 1947, discussing Bergson as a matter of fact, that Heisenberg's uncertainty implies the projection of motion to a static point in the continuum, thus loss of the motion. Feynman and Hibbs, the motion of a particle is continuous but non-differentiable. And Natali in 1996 argued very bluntly that space-time is non-differentiable. What does that mean? Differentiation implies infinite divisibility as we divide the slope of a triangle or of a motion from point A to point B into successively smaller slices, ultimately taking a limit to arbitrarily end what is in fact an infinite operation. That is just making smaller and smaller slices. In the fractal context of Natali, with the awesome implications of the nature of fractals, everywhere one looks at the geodesic curves of space-time, ultimately at the most infinitesimal of scales, one finds an inflection point, meaning the curves cannot be differentiated. That is, there's no velocity derivable at an instant. So Linz, in the Foundation of Physics letters, echoing Bergson, implicitly also reinforcing Natali from a different direction, argued there can be no static instant underlying any dynamic physical process. There is constant change, no matter how infinitely small the interval examined. There is change. If there were such a truly static instant, the entire universe would be frozen, never to change again. No value can then be fixed with certainty. Every equation of physics is subject to uncertainty. It is an intrinsic trade-off, precisely determined values for continuity through time. It is only the human observer, mentally immersed in the abstract space, a projection frame, who imposes a precise instant of time, the static conceptual backdrop upon a physical process. Physical processes being buzzing flies, rotating cubes, falling leaves. So again, the classic metaphysic is a static conceptual backdrop, this continuum of points and positions and instants, the frame in which all processes of the physical world are projected. But as noted, if the infinite division of a trajectory or motion could be completed, it would end at a mathematical point, logically speaking, that is, at an indivisible extent. The process, if you could cease the process of infinite division. This point is no start point, no end, nothing between which the arrow or fly can move. If the point did, it could be divided, start half, end half, and therefore not be indivisible. If time is made up of indivisible instants, instances by definition, there is no motion of the arrow. How does the arrow move? For Bergson, this means, to quote from Creative Evolution, movement is made up of immobilities. That is, it's an absurdity. But this is the very condition of Lin's forever frozen universe. In this model, each instant corresponds to an instant taken across the whole of space. As I move the bottle from point A to point B across the continuum, each position that this indivisible motion, in fact, is supposedly corresponding to also corresponds to an instant of time, and therefore to an instant of the all of space. A block of space, shall we say, taken at a most instantaneous extent of time. But such a static instant as an indivisible mathematical point implies the universe is frozen. There can be no change within that block. All change is impossible. We don't know how to get from one block to the next. The entirety of space would have to be reborn, regenerated, instant after instant. Bergson noted that to Descartes, given this framework, which was Descartes, by the way, the only way to account for change is invoking God. That is, we require God to create each block, one after the other, as each new instant of space. This, of course, is yet another infinite regress. The hidden process behind the regeneration of the entirety of space is now the issue. It would have to be continuous. So, bottom line, there is no interval, no matter how small, in which the universe is not constantly changing. The arrow's position is constantly changing and never occupies one block of space. The turtle, Achilles, never occupy one block of space. So one math solution to Zeno is geometric. The distance traversed and time taken are treated as an infinite geometric series. Each successive term is multiplied by 1/2, each term thus becoming smaller. Such a series converges, taking a limit as it approaches infinity. We arrive at a finite answer for the time Achilles requires to overtake Mr. Toides. This, by the way, was Whitehead's solution. You can see number 53 on this. But this technique simply ignores that infinity is infinity. That is, we've arbitrarily ended the infinite operation by a mathematical convention. That is, the notion of taking a limit. And we've left untouched the problem of Achilles' motion within the static intervals, or any actual physical resolution of the infinities, or a model thereof. This is important. In other words, we just have the static intervals, that is, the static cubes of space. In each of the intervals, it is assumed that the velocity of Achilles is fixed, determined. So on the right there, we have a determined value for velocity in each block. But the values for each interval are not actually representing the time he was at a position, but rather that he was passing through this interval. So these velocity values, v equals distance over time, for each interval are again reliant on the static conceptual backdrop. The reality is he's always passing through this backdrop, no matter how small the interval, into which he has no actual physical relation to this backdrop. So no matter how infinitesimal the time extent of the block in which we're determining that velocity, he is actually passing through it. No fixed value for v can be determined. Let's take again this statement. There's no actual physical resolution of the infinities. This is important. The halving algorithm could be implemented by a robot. Okay, it would never reach the turtle either. If it computed the mathematical series convergence, what would this mean physically? That is, if it would have to take the limit. What would that mean, though, physically? One more big step. It cannot take the step without ending the algorithm, computing the limit. That is, stopping the infinity and taking one actual physical step. He's, again, always passing through this backdrop, no matter how small the interval, into which he has no actual physical relation. The answer here is Achilles is moving in an indivisible motion. So in the classic metaphysic, and we said relativity was the logical extent of this, logical extension, motion becomes rest, simply on change of perspective. That is, it's artificial, not real. We can take the object, it can move across the continuum or the coordinate system, or the continuum or the coordinate system can move beneath the object. That is true. This is what we have when we treat motion as simply a change of position, a change of moving from point to point to point. But all motion cannot be relative. There must be real motion. Real motion. Quote Bergson, though we are free to attribute rest or motion to any material point taken by itself. Notice this is in 1896, before relativity. It is nonetheless true that the aspect of the material universe changes, that the internal configuration of every real system varies, that we have no longer the choice between mobility and rest. Movement, whatever its inner nature, becomes an indisputable reality. We may not be able to say what parts of the whole are in motion. Motion there is in the whole nonetheless. There must be real motion. Stars explode, trees grow, roses bloom, mountain ranges arise. To quote Bergson, of what object, externally perceived, can it be said that it moves, of what other that it remains motionless? To put such a question is to admit the discontinuity established by common sense between objects. Again, remember the original identification of objects and emotions. Objects independent of each other, each having its individuality, comparable to kinds of persons. To admit that is a valid distinction. For on the contrary hypothesis, the question would no longer be how are produced in the given parts of matter changes of position, but how is affected in the whole a change of aspect. We must view the whole as changing, he argued, as though a kaleidoscope. So the motions of separate objects become changes or transfers of state within this global transformation or motion, like waves in the sea. It is a transformation with an inherent simultaneity, and it is indivisible, like a melody. For example, note up there the rose, talking about simultaneities. This organic growth of the rose contains simultaneities. Points on each side of the roads, for example, might reach the same point simultaneously in this growth. But these are simultaneities that cannot be relativized. For example, by some observer going by and claiming that, well, he'd be claiming that he's stationary and somebody's staring right next to the rose is in motion. Therefore, that they're not simultaneous. But if that were true, the growth would be destroyed. You cannot simply relativize points of growth within a rose or a tree or whatever and not think you're destroying the whole growth pattern. In other words, these are simultaneities that cannot be relativized. In other words, it completely undermines the actual notion of relativity. The non-resolution of Zeno's paradoxes, the failure to let Bergson sink in. This resides at the heart of physics and science today. Just to note, jump a look ahead here. This analysis would take us through innumerable theorems in which the structure of physics rests. But just one example, at the heart of quantum mechanics is psi, the wave equation, which supposedly describes perfectly, at least according to some, the time evolution of the universe. At the heart of psi is Euler's identity. So we have psi and we have Euler's identity, e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0. For Feynman, this identity, Euler's identity, is our joule. At the heart of this identity is an infinite series, a series that again never truly converges. Just a picture there. That is, this series is resolved again by taking a limit. That is, only by a mathematical convention, not an actual physical resolution. Again, here's a representation, shall we say partial, of what's at the base of the wave equation. There you have the same Euler identity, e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0. They're in terms of cosine and sine. So it becomes an infinitely repeating cycle of the rotation of sine and cosine. So note, it's always coming back to 0. It's unchanged. There is no development in time. So this is an approximation. But an approximation is not in reality good enough when the subject is the true nature of reality. So let's apply this now to our perception of events, that is, events being ongoing transformations within the universal holographic field. The fly is specified as a portion of the past, indivisible, non-differentiable transformation of the matter field. The fly as wings of blur is also a reflection of the scale of time imposed by the field, imposed upon the field by the dynamics, physical and chemical, of the brain. There is an infinity of possible scales of time here, or an infinity of possible specifications. So here we move to an implication, which is clearly seen by Bergson in Matter and Memory, that the authors of The Relativistic Brain, a book we mentioned in video number 1, did not see. These authors visioned the constraint and the global processing velocity of the brain. But they did not see this, but the value of this constraint can be changed. A catalyst allows an increase in velocity of chemical flows that otherwise would require much higher energy. The notion of chemical flows, the velocity thereof, is given by the Arrhenius equation, pictured right there, where mu is the energy of activation over and above the resting state to get a process going. T is a temperature. Even temperature change can change the chemical velocity. So if we can raise the chemical velocities in neural processes supporting this dynamic wave, reconstructive wave that is the brain, well, increasing the velocity of processes, or shorthand, I like to say raising the energy state, the fly buzzing at normal scale would transition as we raise that energy state to a fly flapping his wings like a heron, to perhaps an ensemble of whirling electrons. In other words, we're changing the scale of time at which the external field is specified. If we relate this more specifically to form and invariance, imagine firstly a cube that's simply slowly rotating. And we begin spinning it up, increasing the spin rate of that cube. It'll pass through a series of, looking from the top down, a series of serrated edge figures, of increasing serrated edges, but always a figure of 4n-fold symmetry till ultimately we hit a figure of infinite symmetry, namely a spinning cylinder. However, we can do the same thing, simply working backwards in terms of a catalyst. That is, increasing the velocity of processes. For example, we start with our guy watching this spinning cylinder there, and we start raising the velocity of processes. The cube, that cylinder would slow down gradually through a series of decreasing serrated edge figures to ultimately the rotating cube. So the dynamics of the brain are imposing a scale of time on the holographic field. Now we can relate this to Bergson's perception and his virtual action principle. So how does the cat determine the velocity of the mouse that he's watching, such that the cat can intercept the mouse, say, at point D? Well, velocity, in other words, he needs to determine the velocity of the mouse to time that jump. And velocity is a function of time. And time requires a reference system. Here we have a reference system. One revolution of the record, say, each time the parrot's tail sweeps past that post, we'll call a second. So our turtle walking by here, let's say he travels 6 feet in one of those turntable turns. So he's traveling 6 feet in 1 second, we're saying. Double the speed, however, of that reference disk. Well, now the turtle will only cover 3 feet in one rotation, and we would have halved this velocity, 3 feet per second. Now the velocity of processes in the brain is, in hypothesis here, the internal reference system. Again, consider introducing a catalyst. The mouse, if we introduce enough catalyst to that cat, its perceived velocity will be lowered. In other words, its lower velocity will be reflective of the cat's greater time to act. He can initiate his action, say, rather than at point A to intercept the mouse at D, now he can initiate the action even at point C to intercept the mouse at D, because he has a greater possibility of action, a greater rapidity of action, and the velocity of the mouse is reflecting this, therefore. One would note that if this is not true, if velocity and perception is not adjusted to action, is not reflecting possible action, there would be anomalies that would occur. The cat would see the mouse is moving slowly and jump, and the mouse would be long gone. So perception must be the reflection of possible action, reflect the possibility of action. The spinning cylinder would be reflective of the hand, how the hand can be adjusted to grasp it. Again, raising the energy state to where we have a cube slowly rotating. Again, that cube reflecting now how the hand can be adjusted to grasp it. The fly with its barely moving ring, to say at the scale of time, very small scale of time, is reflective of how O can act, the organism can act. That is, in this case, could slowly reach out and grasp the fly by the wing. This is testable at some point. If people got serious about it, it could be tested. We should note, if we can do this in principle, that is, raise the energy state of the brain, we must assume that nature has allowed for it. This is why Gibson's invariance laws are required, are necessary for specification of the events of the external world. Effectively, by changing scales and somewhat analogous to relativity, we are changing the space-time partition. The essence of relativity is that only invariance laws hold across all partitions. We have d, distance equal velocity times time, in the one observer system, let's say the guy at rest. But d prime equals vt prime. That is the same law, just different units of time and distance in another observer's reference system, say the person is in motion. Each observer has different units of space and time. It is a different space-time partition, but the law d equal vt holds in both systems. It's an invariant in both systems. Example of this, take Pincher-Shaw's law for the aging transformation of the human head. Aging is a very slow transformation on a normal scale of time. So the head growth or change is specified by strain transformation in a cardioid figure placed over the skull, placed upon a coordinate system. So we have the skull placed on a coordinate system there in the picture. The cardioid is the dot figure. And strain stretches the cardioid and skull in all directions as though it were on a rubber sheet. And increasing the strain value increases the aging. So there we see a few samples of the aging transformation generated, just a few of the skulls generated by simply placing the strain transformation on the cardioid. Suppose the head were transforming rapidly before us at a very fast scale. It is the strain law, an invariance law, that will be specifying how to modulate the hand to grasp the rapidly transforming head. The strain law is an invariance law which holds across space-time partitions. We saw another law like this, the rotating cube, becoming serrated edge figures of always 4n-fold symmetry as we change the space-time partition. This is significant with respect to Bergson's principle that perception is virtual action. The motor areas send reentrant loops into the visual areas of the brain. That is, the visual areas are feeding the motor areas with information, but vice versa, the motor areas are feeding information back into the visual areas. That is, the motor areas are modulating vision. Very important for the virtual action principle. In fact, when the pathways from the motor areas to the visual areas were severed in monkeys by Nakamura and Mishkin, a couple different experiments, the monkeys went blind. Now, this is rather counterintuitive. That is, why would sending information to action and having that pathway cut destroy vision? Well, it's counterintuitive except in the context of perception as virtual action. The computer model, that's quite different. It's conceived as perceiving the world, process, then act in the world. That is the perception-action cycle. We sense, model, plan, act, change the world, etc. What we have here, virtual action, is via the dynamics of the brain. Perception actually is the specification of possible action, and simultaneously the scale of time being placed upon the holographic field. We can alter the specification simply by introducing a catalyst. All this would be totally ad hoc for a computer, for an AI. So taking this all relative to the properties of the holographic field, the field is a globally transforming whole. Within the motion of this whole, there are no objects undergoing motions. The motions of objects are changes or transfers of state. It is like waves in the ocean. This motion is indivisible. It is non-differentiable. This non-differentiable motion of the matter field, or indivisible motion, supports a primary memory. It's the glue of the instants. Because in reality, there are no instants that instantly go into non-existence. The past as the present arrives. This is the memory supporting rotating cubes, buzzing flies, singing violins, etc. The question became, how does the brain specify this motion? Not how does the brain store static samples and then try to integrate them. Note, spinning cubes, twisting leaves, gently waving curtains are qualia. They're motions within the holographic field, or holofield for short, each with a certain quality. A relook at qualia from the perspective of an indivisibly transforming holographic field, well, you see the standard examples of qualia in the literature are basically static. The red of sunset, the taste of cauliflower, the aroma of coffee. Things involving time and the dynamic are never considered, the twisting falling leaf, or Valerie Hardcastle's ever so gently waving curtains. The standard opinion is matter has no secondary qualities, no color, no sounds. Galileo began this at the inception of the classic metaphysic. Only the quantitative is part of matter for Galileo. Everything else is contributed, quote, by the living organism, unquote. That is, everything else is in the mind. Form has been thought to be quantitative. This is a mistake. Thus, he stripped the matter field of quality. This is all the effect of the classic metaphysic, the abstract space and time, where motion is simply change of position and infinitely divisible, each point corresponding to an instant, that is, to an instant of the all of space. Such a space has the time extent of a mathematical point, but each space vanishes as the next arrives. As such, it can have no quality, that is utterly homogeneous. There can be no gently, ever so slightly waving curtains, no falling, twisting leaves, no buzzing flies. And no color, for the color is an aspect of an indivisibly changing electromagnetic field. All qualia requires the indivisibility of motion. The abstract 40-point continuum is homogeneous and qualityless. Hence, it is utterly mysterious to philosophers how qualities, that is qualia, whether of motions, which they never consider, or colors, can arise in this abstract continuum. The classic metaphysic precludes it. And don't forget, the brain in the classic metaphysic is equally embedded in this abstract continuum. It is equally unable to contain or account for qualia. All qualia in this metaphysic are forced into the non-physical, the mental, anywhere but the abstract continuum of points positions. But the step by which these events go into another realm within the confines of the metaphysic remains a dilemma. The metaphysical structure makes it impossible, and these outside realms, for example, the mental or perceptual space, as Joseph Bloch would call it, are thus obscure, incapable of definition to science. For current science works precisely within the classic metaphysic. Given the classic metaphysic, qualia becomes everything not accounted for by computation. Thus, there's struggles. Color qualia is seen by people like Hameroff and Penrose as almost atom-like, little atoms. Qualia, to quote, are in the geometry of space-time, waiting to be correspondingly configured in microtubules. So somehow these are like little atoms sitting in microtubules waiting to be correspondingly configured relative to what's in the outside world. So one would ask, well, are there form qualia then for every possible form and scale of time? Remember, again, we have just like that qualitative change there. You have a smaller scale time for the rotating cube, larger scale of time for the spinning cylinder, form of the cube. So are all these form qualia just waiting in microtubules to be configured? So even worse, remember Valley Hardcastle's list, the patrons shifting in their seats, the musicians concentrating, the curtains ever so gently waving. All qualities of dynamic changing form. Are they all sitting in microtubules? You see the difficulty. The holographic matter field in its non-differentiable indivisible motion is qualitative, or massively, shall we say, qualia. You have a qualitative field. The qualia of experience actually are qualia permeated image of the external world. Say of the coffee cup and stirring spoon and the browns and swirls, etc. Is the brain's specification of sources in this qualitative field at a scale of time. Our buzzing fly was gradually spread out in time. Buzzing, wing beats 200 per second, a blur. Flapping wings, slowly like a heron. So taking longer and longer to create that event of the buzzing fly. Motionless, starting to see the shimmering oscillations of the fly's crystalline-like body, or an ensemble of swirling electrons. So we're getting a vaster and vaster scale. So spread out in time, the blurred instants become a vast extended structure. The blurred wing beats become a vast extended structure of events. For Bergson, he wanted the color red. 1 second of red light equals 400 billion wave oscillations. If you were to spread this out such that we could discriminate each wave, it would take 25,000 years to count each wave. So again, a vastly extended structure. So Bergson argued, may we not conceive, for instance, that the irreducibility of two perceived colors is due mainly to the narrow duration into which are contracted the billions of vibrations which they execute in one of our moments. If we could, like 1 second of red light, if we could stretch out this duration, that is to say, live at a slower rhythm, should we not, as the rhythm slowed down, these waves spread out, see these colors pale and lengthen into successive impressions, still colored, no doubt, but nearer and nearer to coincidence with pure vibrations. In other words, as we move closer to the universal field taken at the null scale of time, that is the smallest extent we can imagine of time, smallest scale of time, we come ever closer to the continuum of points and the abstract homogeneous space, that is our cubes of the classic metaphysic. But this is all important. This is an ideal limit. It's never reached. This abstract continuum of points and positions and instants is never reached. It does not actually exist. The brain does not dwell in the universe of the classic metaphysic. It could care less about it. Edges, straight lines, geometric forms, as Gibson noted, do not exist for the brain. The brain is embedded within and intrinsically part of the indivisibly transforming field of the temporal metaphysic. For it, there can be only invariance over flows. The classic metaphysic is derived. It's derived by the brain working in, embedded in, the universe of the temporal metaphysic. As we'll see later, our very notion of computation, the fundamental concept underlying the computer model of the brain, is equally a derivative. So when we come to color, there's no features support it, supposedly. Color is supposedly an illusion, just in the mind. No one feature of the matter field determines color, not hue, not reflectance, and light conditions can change the color. But then no features support dynamic form either. Color is equally an optimal specification of vibrational aspects of the holographic field. For more discussion on this and why this must be so, I went through this in number 66 on relative to Purvis and Lotto and Gibson and color. So now we come to the question of subject and object, which we can put this way. How do we avoid the homunculus, the little guy in the brain, watching the projected image or the specified image, which would then lead to a regress, or removing the viewer, as in the little red box there in the holographic process picture. It's Bergson's principle. Questions related to subject and object, to the distinction and the union must be put in terms of time rather than of space. So, a bit Zen-like, and we'll see why. We noted the dynamic transformation of this holographic field is indivisible, where each instant interpenetrates or permeates the next as the notes of a melody, and where each note instant reflects the entire preceding series of notes. Now, there's a deep implication in this. If the state of each point or / event in the field reflects the influences of the whole, in fact, the history of the whole, in effect, each point at the null scale of time, or the infinitely smallest scales, has an elementary awareness of the whole. Bergson called this pure perception. It's as though stretched across the universal matter field as a vast, vibrant web of awareness. It's a highly coherent web. The thread-like fibers are taut. A light flick with a finger sends reverberations instantly throughout the whole. This web, with its basic elemental awareness and its fundamental primary memory, as the web transforms indivisibly over time, carries the elementary attributes of mind. And I stress elemental in both cases. Yes, this is a form of panpsychism, a unique one. We do not need tiny proto-conscious particles here. We do not need to solve the aggregation problem, where that is how the consciousness of each particle is somehow, in some mysterious, inexplicable way, aggregated together to form a larger consciousness, such as that of humans, and thus the perception of the coffee cup, or even of chipmunks, with the perception of the acorn. The brain, as a reconstructive wave, is specifying a scale of time on this holographic field as a function of the invariant structures relative to the body's action systems, a form, that is, of the elemental awareness defined across the field, is specifying a form of this awareness. This is the panpsychism never discussed by philosophy, because Bergson was never understood. The panpsychists have never understood that panpsychism of itself is not a solution for the origin of the image of the external world. That is the hard problem. But note, again, this web, this is the null scale of time. That is the null scale being the most infinitely small scale of time imaginable. The scale of an instant of infinitely small extent, not the scale of buzzing flies, stirring spoons, or falling leaves, or rolling acorns. The brain, a chipmunk's or a human's, as a reconstructive wave embedded in this field, passing through it, is specifying past portions of the change of this field at a particular scale of time, a buzzing fly or a heron-like fly. And remembering virtual action, all is coordinate with the organism's action capability. For the frog, at his time scale, a slowly moving fly, easily flicked out of the air with its tongue. Our brain is establishing a certain ratio relative to the micro events of the matter field. In the fly's case, relative to the micro events making up the body of the fly, his wing beats, his internal processes. A little Gedanken or thought exercise. Conceive of our body and the fly side by side within the universal field at the null scale, that infinitely small scale. We see there's no spatial differentiation between our body and the fly. Both of these objects, quote unquote, our body and the fly, are simply phases, transfers of state in the global transformation of the holofield. But now allow our brain to gradually specify an increasing time scale in its specification. You get a ratio of proportionality as defined by the brain, an environment/organism or E/O ratio. Gradually raising this ratio, the fly transitions from an undifferentiated phase of the field at the null scale, it is non-differentiation from the body and the fly, spatially, to an ensemble of quarks, again, just using an arbitrary ratio to show the increase, a world of electrons, a motionless form, the heron-like fly, to the buzzing being of our normal scale. Subject is differentiating from object. But the essential unity of the two within the matter field, our body and the little fly, is never broken spatially. So we arrive at Bergson's principle. Subject is differentiated from object, not in terms of space, but of time. The dynamical state of the brain is specific to a source or sources within the holographic field, and simultaneously, then, to a time-scaled form of the elemental awareness defined throughout the universal field. Put another way, or to a time-scaled subset of the pure perception defined throughout the field. Or, to make sense of Bergson's quote, then, the question is not how perception arises, but how it is limited. So the brain is specific to a time-scaled subset of this pure perception defined throughout the field. So yes, this is all very consonant with the experience of Zen enlightenment. There's a koan from the Zen master Basui that goes, "Who is it that hears? Let the koan become, who is it that sees?" Remember, one meditates on these koans until enlightenment is achieved. The basis for the experiential answer to in Zen enlightenment is clear. There's no one that sees. What is being specified is a modified, perspective-based, action-relevant form of the elementary awareness defined throughout the holographic field at a given scale of time. For Jean Piaget, the great child developmental theorist and once student of Bergson, in our initial state, there is no differentiation between child and world, from mother, from any objects, quote unquote. All is part of the child's self. All is one undifferentiated matrix or field. For Bergson, in this quote-unquote matrix of experience, the body becomes the invariant, or is the invariant. Our identity settles on the body. We become an object among other objects, a source of force among other sources of force. We begin to need a koan. This is Bergson, the great and unique panpsychist, the original externalist, the exponent of inactivism, the powerful direct realist, all unrecognized not only by Searle, as we started at number 1, but by most of the philosophic world. So down the road, again, list what is thought and cognition, implications for AI and the singularity, explicit memory, free will, implications of education, evolution, and relativity, among many others, as it turns out. If you don't find these numbers on these subjects on academia.edu, the numbers I've referenced through on my YouTube channel, Stephen E. Robbins. How does memory work? For experience is not wholly occurring solely within the brain, within this model, so it cannot be solely stored there. Hence the discussion. So till then, signing off.